At the end of the day, it's not about what you have or even what you've accomplished. It's about what you've done with those accomplishments. It's about who you've lifted up, who you've made better. It's about what you've given back. Denzel Washington. Welcome to Inspire Vision. Our sole purpose is to elevate the lives of others and to inspire you to do the same.
Albert, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here, Dr. Doug.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. I'd love for you to share, number one, you've written a book. Can you tell the audience what the book is and what the name of it is?
Sure. It's called Rise Above the Script, Confronting Self-Doubt and Mastering Self-Sabotage for Performing Artists. It was published in 2024, and it was based on my doctoral thesis, Why Actors Self-Sabotage. And so just to give you a backstory, I work with actors. I am a talent agent in New York, so I represent actors professionally for film, TV, theater, Broadway, off-Broadway, and I've been doing this for, over 20 years, since 2004. But when I first started, I was noticing a lot of actors were self-sabotaging, which means that they were shooting themselves in the foot, denying themselves an opportunity, getting in their own way. And as I was also starting to go for my PhD in psychology, and as a, doctoral student, and sort of like my scientific mind was like starting to get curious here, like, why is this happening? And so I decided to do it from a dissertation, solve a problem in a sense. So that's what, this is how the book kind of came out. So it's been in progress for years. And while the book is geared towards actors and written, initially for actors, it's really, there's a lot of good insight in here that can really be applicable to anybody.
Well, and that's true. You talk about the actors, and you mentioned the imposter syndrome, and I know there's a specific psychological definition for that, but I've come up with my own definition, or at least an alternate definition, and that's people who are acting. They are literally acting as though they think they should act and behave rather than who they really are. And so in the case, we're all kind of actors, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, we're playing a role every day. Whether we're with our family, in our professional circles, with our significant others, we're playing different roles. With our parents, with our children, if we have children, we're playing different roles. We're playing, Carl Jung called it the persona. We're putting on a persona. So yeah, we think about we're all sort of actors, and I think even your definition can, even fit into the traditional definition to some level. Yeah, because if you're saying if you're acting, maybe you're not acting, in the authentic way.
So true. And when you talk about rising above the script, what is the script? What's your definition of the script for people?
So the script is different than, when people hear script, they think of the, a paper or a play or something they're reading. But here I'm talking about the script in your mind, especially your subconscious mind.
Okay. All right. So let's get into that. I mean, as you've noticed, the actors, and you mentioned a little bit earlier before we came on that you work with a number of students, and so who are not necessarily actors, right?
Right. But if you want to think on a pure scheme of things, they are actors, they're students. But what I've noticed, even with them, is like, some of them are really bright and really intelligent, but they would stop coming to class, they would stop doing the work, and I couldn't figure out what's really happening here, initially in the beginning. Or they would even talk, use negative self-talk, or I'm not a good test taker, I'm not a good student. And they would actually really verbatimly explicitly say that. So I've always wondered what's really going on here.
Yeah, and it's interesting how they start to talk to themselves, and that becomes their reality. When in fact, and this is a tough one, because you talk about reality, and from my understanding, reality is strictly based on perceptions, mainly
Yeah,
subconscious, and that becomes reality. And your reality is going to be so different than my reality.
of course, and that's how reality is subjective. There's really no objective reality.
Yeah.
Like, and, even on a pure, if for the listeners out there, think about, you go to see a movie with a friend. You could have thought it was the greatest movie ever, and your friend could have thought it was, a terrible movie.
Yeah. Oh,
And the
yeah.
question is, who's right, who's correct, and you both are, in a sense, because it's
Well, yeah.
your perception.
Yeah, that's so true. So we've mentioned imposter syndrome. Can you, as a psychologist, could you share with the audience the actual definition of the imposter syndrome as we
So
talk
the
about?
idea of imposter syndrome, the word imposter means fraud.
Yes.
So what happens very often is, we start to doubt ourselves and we start to feel like we're frauds. Like, and that there's also that fear of we're going to be found out too, that we're frauds. Like for me, it could be like, well, like if I'm debating I want to write a book or not, no one's going to I'm going to get bad reviews. No one's going to like my book. So what'll happen is won't do it, period. I won't put myself out there, or they think that someone's going to find out I really don't know everything. And therefore, the best way to shield myself from that is I won't apply myself. I won't put myself out there. It'll be safe. Let me play it safe. And so it's really a self-imposed limitation too.
And is it usually based on what, fear, or what is it?
Multiple factors, but fear, I would say, would be the primary motivator. The primary focus would be fear, fear of failure, and even fear of success too. Success can be scary.
Well, and it's interesting. You hear so many different levels of intellect saying, do not fear, thou shalt not fear, on and on and on. And yet fear seems to be one of the major experiences that we all have to some degree, to a certain level. How do you work with your students? How do you work with people who are exhibiting a great deal of fear, and how do you observe what their behavior is? How do you pick up the fact that in working with someone that, okay, one of their major challenges is fear?
Well, it would be looking for the signs, like they don't want to try anything new. They want to stay in their routine, their comfort zone. And that's the biggest, thing. One of the biggest telltale signs is someone unwilling to step outside their comfort zone or try anything new, or, take any risks. Again, playing it safe is probably the biggest indicator. If they're playing it safe by not doing, things that would make them slightly uncomfortable. Again, it could be, putting your resume out there. It could be, going on stage to make a presentation. That could be scary. So one of the best ways the only way you're going to really overcome fear is by facing it. By facing your fears. So that would mean putting yourself out there, by, go, whether it's, even if it's if you have a fear of public speaking, go speak at a small stage, 5-10 people. Do something on Zoom, that where it's safe from your own home, at least in the beginning, and then gradually build from there. But the only way you're going to face that fear, or really get over that fear, overcome that fear, is by facing it head on, and by confronting it. So, again, that fear is going to work against an actor, because as an actor or a performer, you really have to put yourself out there if you want to have a working life or any momentum of success. So that the fear of auditioning, or the fear of putting yourself out there, has to be overcome. And a lot of times we're in denial. Like we don't even realize a lot of times we have these fears, consciously.
Yeah, and it's interesting, as I've interviewed a number of lovely ladies who have gone through some horrendous experiences in their life and found themselves in those codependent relationships with men who are abusers, right? And they can't get out of it. And ultimately they do. But as we've talked about that, one of the biggest things that comes up is the fear of change. In other words, they're more fearful of change than they are of the present environment and experience. So as you talk about fear, we've got fear of change, we've got fear that I'm not good enough. What are some of the other fears that come about that are really imprints in people's subconscious minds that in many cases they had no control over that initially?
Yeah, fear of disappointing others, letting other people down. And I think that also ties in the whole codependency or the people pleasing mindset is, well, if I say no, or if I set a boundary, I'm going to disappoint them. And maybe that could do with the way we were raised too, because very often I would even imagine that a lot of these, codependent women and men, because I believe it's an equal thing.
I agree.
Grow up, I think, even with parents that they had to jump through hoops to get their parents' approval. Whether again that was reality or their perception, that they had to work really hard to get their parents' approval, and maybe they didn't get it enough of that, so they substitute adult relationships with their parents in a sense. That goes on subconsciously. So that fear of letting other people down, again, fear of success, fear of money is also one that I kind of discovered. And I wrote a chapter about this in my book, is fear of money. Because a lot of times you may grow up in families where you're told money is the root of all evil.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not an evil person. I don't want to be evil. And actually that quote was taken out of context.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of things that are taken out of context that really have inundated people with a feeling of guilt, of shame, of all of those types of things.
Mm-hmm.
So how often as you're working with people, this gets to be a very delicate subject, and I've had other people talk about it a little bit, and definitely some psychologists talk about the fact that as you're starting to work with people who are really self-sabotaging, as you can observe that, they're in the imposter syndrome, they're self-sabotaging, they're not experiencing the life that they truly deserve or could have. And they go off to therapy, and they go through talk therapy, and nothing gets resolved. And, having a PhD in psychology, this might be a sensitive issue there, but I know just based on reading your bio and going to your website that you use NLP, you probably, I don't know, I think you use hypnosis. You're using all sorts of tools rather than just talking. And can you talk a little bit about that to the audience who are seeking some help? What are some of the things that they need to look for in an individual that can really be of value to them as a mentor or whatever you want to call them?
Obviously you want someone who's not personally invested in you, someone who's, going to be objective. And also, I'll flat out, the reason why I studied hypnosis and NLP was because I was a little disillusioned with psychology. I was in, when I was going to grad school, for my master's and PhD, we had a lot, some professors that were telling us about cases that they were working with someone who was in their office for years for therapy. And I kept ending up in my head. I'm like thinking, if you're, going for 8 or 9 years of therapy and the client is not getting better, something isn't adding up here.
Yeah.
Something is not working. So I felt like, the reason why I like NLP, it's a little more rapid. It's a little more fast paced. And, sometimes it's just getting out of your head and reframing things. And working with some thoughts.
Let's talk about NLP just a little bit, because I think it's important for people to understand some of these processes that are available that they should look for in a professional. And one of them I know is NLP. You talked about reframing. So when you're working with someone and you use the NLP process, what are you actually trying to accomplish with your person?
For a little bit of shift in mentality or thought process, looking at things in a different way, viewing things in a different light. So, We're not denying the experience. What we're doing is, like I said, changing it, turning it around, and looking at either the bright side or the learning experience from that. So one of the things of NLP is like there's no such thing as failure, only feedback. So reframing failure or mistakes as learning opportunities, because this way it empowers a person to not beat themselves up. That okay, this is learning opportunities. And when I work with actors, another NLP reframe I use when it comes to rejection, because I hear a lot of people say about the word rejection, and I've always felt like there's no such thing as rejection. It's just simply that your services are not needed right now or today. Because rejection is personal. It means then it starts rooting in your subconscious. When you keep hearing the word rejection, it's like, well, that means you're rejecting me at my core. And strictly from an acting perspective, there's only one person that can get hired for a role or for any job. And there's going to be hundreds of applicants sometimes. Only one person can get the job. So it's not personal.
Okay.
And I think if you it frees if you really adopt that, it's not personal. Okay, well, now, what can I learn from that?
Any stories of people you've worked with, without using their names, obviously, but where they have been really experiencing, failure or whatever that happens to be, and by using that approach of NLP, that you've been able literally to help them reframe that experience and that event, and watch them come out of that into a much more positive, successful situation. Any stories you can share?
Yeah, I mean, even I'll tell two. One was from an actors I kind of was working with. I used to occasionally be a guest in an acting class, giving like my agent perspective on things. And there was this one actress who was studying for over 10 years and just wasn't booking work. And then I just kind of would work together, her and acting teacher and myself worked with her to step into her power and step into her sweet spot, which was like her type was tough, powerful, heart of gold. And so I had her mentally rehearse that tough, powerful, heart of gold. How would someone with a tough, powerful heart of gold order a coffee from the barista? How would someone with a tough, powerful heart of gold, talk to a customer? And, just simple things like that reframe. When she started getting to a power, it took her a few months before she booked a couple speaking roles in TV, in network TV projects. Another time, this was, several years ago, as a college professor, I put class participation as part of the grade. Not a large percentage, but just percentages are great, at the end of the semester. So I had one student at the end of the second class send me an email saying, like, I don't appreciate this. It's kind of, not fair that you're putting, requiring for class participation. So rather than getting defensive, which I think a lot of professors probably would have, I responded as if, no, you're helping me out. I want to hear your perspective on things. You have such interest in things to say. And so can we work on, you contributing a little bit here? I want to hear what you have to say. And so does the class. And when I reframed it as that, by the end of the semester, she was one of the most vocal students in the class.
Wow.
So a lot of it is just simple reframing. And, whether, again, the mistakes, what did you learn from that? What can you do the next time?
Well, and you talk about reframing, and at least in my mind right now, you're talking about very surface reframing that people can learn to do. That as they start to experience things, they can say, all right, they can step outside themselves and observe what's going on and reframe that and help them to understand,
Mm-hmm.
okay, this will be a little bit different. When you go a little bit deeper, I had someone I was working with, and we had gone through a number of personality profiling lessons and so on and so forth. And about a year later, he called me up and he said, hey, can we get together? And I said, sure. Yeah, come on over to the house. And so he came over and we were talking. He says, I am just sabotaging. I am just making such terrible decisions and I can't figure out why. And he had gone through a lot of stuff with me. And so I said, all right, let's do this. Let's use an NLP process. And I explained a little bit about what that is. And let's see if we can get to the root cause of what's going on here. And so we went through a very, very specific NLP process, and we got back to his childhood and grade school, where he remembers his teacher saying, you're stupid, and put him in the back of the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And as we looked at that, and as we talked about it, and obviously reframed it, and as he was able to consciously reframe that and realize, that had nothing to do with him because he was extremely bright. But the reality is that that teacher, for some reason, was expressing emotions in a way and perhaps even being a bit of a bully, or he was doing something that was creating an emotion in her. And so she just put him in the back of the room. Once he got that reframed, all of a sudden I saw him change a position within his company, and he just became prolific. He started making more money than he'd ever made. It was just amazing what he did. And so to me, that was so interesting to realize that as you can help someone literally get back to the real nitty gritty of childhood and some of those type of imprints, that reframing those experiences can make such a difference. Do you get that deep sometimes with clients?
Yeah, I mean, because what it sounds a bit is like you're working with something called timeline, where it's going back to an earlier imprinting, something where it was an imprint where, a remark, even it could be an innocent casual remark that someone may have, not realizing what they said, but it really like become embedded in their subconscious mind. So, and that can sometimes be, going back to childhood and change and reframing that. There's a technique, it's kind of deeper work, but that I've used is something called the inner child work, or where we heal the inner child. So all of us, if you believe that, we all have the inner a little mini me inside of us that still maintains our childlike innocence and wonder. And sometimes if that child is wounded, again through maybe innocent remarks that not as a way is it, but like small remarks that our parents or teachers have said. Doesn't have to be a major trauma, it just be like little things, day in the life traumas in the sense that just add up. So sometimes what I might do even in a stepping outside yourself is like going back and telling that little child, that little boy or that little girl, that everything's going to be okay. And that, you are smart, you are intelligent. And that I found has been very profound.
Well, and it's interesting, isn't it? As you say, as parents, we may make certain remarks to our children, which we think are very positive, but the thing that we cannot control is their perception of what they just heard. And that perception, as we know, becomes their reality and their belief, which stays with them until they can get back to the point where they reframe that and become conscious about that. So how much do you get into this whole concept of not only identifying what those limiting self-destructive behaviors are and beliefs are, but how much do you get into mindset, into consciousness, and recognizing that an individual who can truly become conscious and aware of those type of situations and acknowledge them rather than allowing them to affect them? How are you able to get into that?
Well, just by reframing and gently pointing, kind of letting, pointing things out, or, similarities here. Because I feel like once you are able to consciously, call out these patterns in yourself, that's where change can begin. True change can begin. The insight, again, it's like almost that saying, you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And, in a sense, it's a double, bind there, but it's true. And I think that a lot of it is just becoming aware of it. Because then you could develop what we call a growth mindset, which is, one of the most valuable skills to have. There's a book that, I loved, growing when I was in grad school, was Mindset by Carol Dweck. And, she talked about the importance of a growth mindset and how that is really important for developing resiliency, building buffers, in a sense. So, having that growth mindset, extremely important, being able to learn from mistakes and learn from challenges and actually enjoy them.
So as you talk about that, I know one thing you talk about in your book is techniques for raising self-esteem. And as we talk about self-esteem as a definition, really isn't that anyone who's experiencing these subconscious beliefs that literally cause them to think I'm not good enough, blah, 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 all of these type of things. And as you're talking about techniques to raise self-esteem, what are you talking about in your book? What are some of the steps that you could share with the audience who may be experiencing a lack of self-esteem or high esteem to help them to start to develop a better sense of self-esteem?
Well, one of the techniques I took overall about is creating what I call a happy file, which is a journal. Taking a journal of all the things that you're, either grateful for or even all the things that happened to you that was positive. Someone gave you a good compliment. We got a good performance review at work, or, you got good feedback from an audition, or, if you were a performer, you got a good review, feedback from the audience or a review. Every little thing you document. And then when you're having those moments of self-doubt, pull out that to remind you. Pull out your happy file. So that's one technique that I talk about. Also, the company you keep too. I mean, a lot of, self-help and psychology, experts will tell you, you're the sum of the company you keep.
Yes.
So it might mean changing the company you're around too. Hang out with other more successful people because they'll build you up. Consequently, being around negative people will bring you down.
Well, and that's so true, isn't it? And that can be really tough sometimes. Sometimes it's family members that are literally the negative influences on you. So how do you help people to make that disconnect and have the courage, literally, to make that disconnect and to realize that that's part of what's affecting them in a negative way?
Well, pointing that out, and then also pointing, really, it's going to take time, but I think the important thing to understand, it's not about you personally. Even though they may be, saying negative remarks about you or shooting down your accomplishments, a lot of it has to do with their own fears and insecurities. So, and it's not about you. So, kind of reframing like that, like they're projecting their own insecurities onto you.
Okay,
and
so here comes my question that comes to my mind, and it's kind of an off the cuff question. How much is social media, the news media, and all of that have become the people that we surround ourselves with and are being totally affected by that? Because we see such a dichotomy now and such anger coming from all different sides at this point in time.
I would say this has become really more polarizing in the past 5 years. We all know what happened 5 years ago. So I think that, is part of that. I think, the thing about social media, and I've always said social media is like a double-edged sword, meaning that there's some good things, we can be connected, we're able to really expand our network, our reach, but also at the same time, there's a cost. And what we, and a lot of research has found, especially found that the more, especially for teens and young adults that use social media, the more mental health crises they're going to experience. Depression and anxiety goes through the roof.
Wow.
Because it's isolating if you think about it. Even though we may appear to be connected, we're actually isolating, by spending more time on, social media. And you see people who put the best foot forward, and then you have the whole phenomenon of grass is greener on the other side, and you start to think, well, maybe my life is not, because everybody else seems to be doing so well, and here I am struggling. So that can add to fuel to the fire. And then you have the anonymity, which, of social media, which makes people a lot braver online than they are face to face.
Well,
and which means it could be more bullying and crueler sometimes.
And it's interesting to me to see some friends of mine that I've known for years that have suddenly taken up a cause that is just really, from what I can see, is based on anger, on frustration, and their posts now and their comments are just, where does that come from? And I'm saying that to myself. What happened here? And then as we get into it a little bit more, I realized that, there's a lot of things that went on in the past that have placed those imprints. And, it's so interesting that we can no longer be both and rather than either or, and realize that, I have my point of view. You have your point of view. I would suspect if we got into a discussion about some of those things, we probably are a little bit on the opposing sides there. But the reality is if you can respect my thoughts and I can respect your thoughts, not necessarily agree, but respect the fact that there's some validity, all of a sudden that changes the whole dimension of the communication, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah. And it's just trying to get the emotion, it's like trying to get the emotion out of the argument. The argument is great. I want to hear the argument, but we need to tamper down the emotion a bit, the anger, the thing in that. And sometimes I often feel when I see people that are really enraged, and again, I'm not talking, it's for other side. I'm often wondering if that's really what's going on. It's really made them angry. Something else is not happening. And they're just using that as a target or displacing their rage onto another target.
I suspect that's true in many cases. I remember as I was going through some certifications, one of the comments that the fellow that was doing one of them, and we were talking about the imprints and so forth and relationships. And he said, you know what? And I've shared this before. He says, this is something you never want to do with your spouse or your significant other, but it's something that you ought to do. And he says, when you get into a situation where there's a disagreement and strong feelings going on, the question you can ask is, what emotion just came up for you that is causing this type of reaction? Well, if we ask ourselves that with the proper mindset, all of a sudden we're realizing that, we're reacting because of emotion. And where did that emotion come from?
It could be something from our childhood, like, where, you may be thinking you're fighting with someone on social media, and yet what's subconscious is going, maybe you're fighting back with your father when you were 5 or 6, and that's where that anger comes in, or that energy, that displeasure comes in. And you may think consciously it's about the other person or about the issue, but it's not. It's something deeper that needs to come in. And that's why I think we're seeing that, especially in the past, 8 years, just the amount of anger that we've been seeing on social media on both sides has been, a bit disturbing almost, to see it.
It's major disturbing. But what, to me, it's interesting that an individual, if they can, could get to the point where they can literally say to themselves, okay, what's causing this emotion? Events are events. Events do not have emotion. Events are non-emotion, but we tie an emotion to an event based on our perception or whatever that happens to be.
Yeah.
And, how people can get to the point where they can understand that, I think takes a lot of curiosity, a lot of personal work and help from others. One of the things that you talked about that I wanted to get into a little bit was personality traits. And I don't know if you do personality or behavioral evaluations. That's something that I happen to be certified in, and I found it very interesting. But as you look at personalities, how important is it for someone to begin to really understand that from a perspective of living their life, choosing their profession, and those type of things? What's been your experience with that?
Well, in my book, I have a whole unit on personality because I focus on one of the most, I guess popular models is the Big Five, the five-factor model, which is openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Now, all of us have, these 5 traits to varying degrees. So I think what's important, at least from my perspective, is to understand where you fall into that, into these 5, and then if there's ways to optimize it, to optimize these 5 so they work for you. And in my research, because that's what I did for my doctoral dissertation, one of the variables I measured when I was measuring self-sabotage was I was looking at the Big Five and seeing what the relationship was with the Big Five and the self-sabotage. And so what I found, and this is when I did after I did my research, was that if you are high in neuroticism, which means emotional reactivity, being easily stressed out, and low in conscientiousness, if you combine those 2 together, that's going to be a greater predictor of self-sabotaging behavior.
Uh-huh.
Because now you're letting fear run you, but you're not necessarily as disciplined as you should be. And, so I have my, one of the projects I do in my classes for my students is I have them take an instrument, an inventory that measures the Big Five-factor model. I also have them do the Myers-Briggs, which gives them a bit of a personality profile. And then I have them react to it. I don't do any because that's not my job there, but I just have them reflect on it. And then, so I think that just understanding your own personality also can be an impact, which I kind of see missing a little bit in the clinical psychology piece, work. Is really understanding the personality factors and how you can optimize that, like how you can become more conscientious, how you can become more, open-minded, and even, work on your agreeableness. And then when you work on those variables, that's when you could start to see some changes.
Well, and what's interesting to me, and I've not used the Big Five, and I don't use the Myers-Briggs. I've done that, and I don't understand it. I've got a brother that loves it. I've used something different that I found was very, very, valuable for me to use with people and with clients. And one of the things that I realized is, and I think this is where understanding your personality traits is so important, because every personality trait that we can observe or we can begin to understand is a very positive thing for us. The challenge is if we overdo it, then suddenly that becomes a problem. So for instance, and I work on the right brain, left brain, external, type of thing. But, the left brain or the right brain extrovert is that person that just loves to be in a community, loves to chat, so on and so forth. And it's wonderful. I love to be around them because I tend to be an introvert. So if I can be around people that just will chat and so forth, that's great. But all of a sudden, when it becomes yap, 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 and never stops, that strength has now become a weakness because they've not been able to be in total control of it. Or someone who's left brain extrovert, who's just really strong-willed and so forth, that's great, and really is motivation for success and all of that type of stuff. But as that becomes a little bit too much, now you are overbearing. You're really using words and using, body language that is a little bit overwhelming to people who are receiving that communication. So I think it's so interesting that we can really look at those strengths and understand that, if I keep those strengths in the proper value, that they really have great strength, but I need to be aware that if they go a little bit too far, then all of a sudden they become a disadvantage.
Yeah. Well, I think it's relying on anything too much, even as a crutch, sometimes can be, be a disadvantage. And again, it's what works for you. I mean, the reason I like the Big Five is I feel it really fits into the work of self-sabotage very well, at least for me. And I always like to preface that for me, and I think that's also another thing too, because it's our perception, really. I think also too much of anything is, not always optimal. Like even for extroverts, it's time we need time to, decompress and recharge. Yeah. Even for me, I like being around people, but sometimes if I'm in a group, like a large room with a lot of people, I have to step aside because I'm like, okay, this is a little too much for me right now. But even though I do like being around people a lot, it's, I know my limits, like, okay, I'm not a really big fan of large crowds, but that's me. So I think just understanding yourself is a major insight. Again, it doesn't really matter what personality model that you use. I think, just having that self-understanding.
Exactly. And being able to understand that, as you were talking about, there's balance. There needs to be balance in our lives,
yes,
which I think becomes so important. My daughter, who ended up getting a master's degree in sociology, but mainly research, and she was going to move towards her PhD, and called me one day and she said, "Dad," and she's major with the personality profile I use. She's major right brain extrovert. And she says, I'm not sure, as I observe the lives of the PhDs at the university here, I'm not sure that's going to give me the type of balance in life that I'm looking for. And so she made the brave decision, because she was on a pathway to end it and just get her master's degree and then basically get into an entirely different area, but use that education as a background that has helped her to be very successful. So I think it's so important that we really look at balance in our lives and understand that, if we can create a good balance, we can then create a greater sense of happiness and joy in our lives.
100%. And, going back to what I was saying before, like if we look at even the traits in the Big Five, you don't want to be on two extremes on the other end.
Yeah.
Too high or too low. Because even like one of the things I talk about in the book is being agreeable. Agreeableness is great, to be coachable and be open-minded and being able to follow directions. But at the same time, if you're too agreeable, you can be taken advantage of. And there's times when if you're negotiating, whether it's to buy a house or a salary or anything like that, you have to stand your ground, which means being disagreeable a little bit.
Yeah. Well, we could talk about all sorts of things here, but as we're getting near the close, what I'd love for you to do is share with the audience, how can they find you, and what other than your book, what are some of the things that you offer to people?
So on my website, albertbramante.com, I have a lot of hypnosis audios, which have to do anything with mindset, athletic performance, and working with fears and phobias, anxieties, and it helps. They're recordings that you can buy, and that's one way we can help. You could also just, I post a lot on my social media, my LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn. I post a lot of content there. I'm working on starting a Substack right now, which will be, articles on mindset and articles on that. So be sharing that with the community. So you can follow me again on Instagram and LinkedIn for that. And, even feel free to reach out. I'm always open to conversations.
And how do you find your book? How do you find your book?
Okay, so you go on, it's available on Amazon, Rise Above the Script. You can get it as a paperback, Kindle, or audiobook. I have it also an audiobook.
Great. I love audiobooks.
Yes, so they're great.
Yeah, they're great. So as we close, what would be kind of that final message that you'd like to share with the audience?
So the final message I would say is connect to your why. Like really, every day reflect on why you're doing what you're doing, what you're setting out to do. And really stay committed to that. So know your why. I would say pretty much would be the biggest message I'd want to say, because that'll keep you focused. That'll keep you dedicated. Remembering each day why you're doing what you're doing.
Well, and I think that really gets to a purpose and understanding your purpose. And
Yes.
you say, even asking why am I behaving this way? Why am I bringing up this emotion? So I love that, because it not only gets into purpose, but it gets into a mindset that helps you to really start to improve your life.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And the emotions and mindsets, even the ones that may be working against us, I always say have a positive intention, and that's to protect us.
Yeah.
So now let's maybe work on it, reframing it so it could still protect us, but in a different way.
Amen to that. Well, hey, Albert, thanks so much. This has been great.
Well,
I
and
really
thank you, Dr.
appreciate the
Doug, for inviting me.
conversation. Yeah, I appreciate you being on the show.
Me too. Thank you again for having me.
You bet. And folks, thanks for listening. Hope you've enjoyed it. Get to the website. There's some good things there. I can promise you. I've already been there and I observed that. So anyway, this is Dr. Doug saying namaste.